Good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you. Before I introduce Jim, I do want to say that we certainly encourage free speech here, but we also know how important civil discourse is. And Jim is going to speak, and then we will have time for some questions at the end. And we need to keep civil discourse at the forefront of our mind. Okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Jim, the man who needs no introduction, really. He's recognized around the world as a pioneer and leader of the global interreligious and intercultural movement. He has lectured widely in the US and around the world on a variety of subjects relating to politics, religion, history, and culture. He was, for 45 years, the co-founder and executive director of Common Ground, a groundbreaking adult study center focusing on the world's greatest religious, philosophical, spiritual, and cultural traditions. He is author of Thriving in the Cross-Current, Clarity and Hope in a Time of Cultural Sea Change. That is from 2010. And most importantly, must I say that Jim comes to us and lectures with us. And we've had you on politics, Jim. We're gonna have to eventually go back to religion one of these days. But it's been a hot couple years, and you always seem to lead us in the right direction. So, no, Jim, take it away.
Well, I hope that I don't know. Thanks, Vanessa. You always give me an introduction that I can't really respond to because it's too over the top, but I do like that better than under. Okay, we're going to talk about the midterms. Quite amazing what has happened here. We're going to talk a little bit about polling. Perhaps you all fall in the group that thinks the polls were wildly wrong. When actually they weren't at all. The problem is that we don't know how to read polls or understand polls, and we misconstrue them. The polls were about as accurate, the public polls, not the private polls that are conducted for campaigns, not the polls that are conducted for political parties, but the public polls did pretty well this year, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But nevertheless, we all ended up a little bit surprised, although I hope you were keeping an open mind as we went into Tuesday's elections and realizing that the result was not locked. It was not set in stone by any means, but we certainly discovered that. The other thing I want to say is that I am unapologetic in my blue leanings. I don't lean blue. I bleed blue. So that's a bias you have to figure in. I said before when we were just getting ready to get started that it's not actually a bias. It has more to do with information. Anyway, here we are. I'm going to go ahead and screen share. Takes a minute, so bear with me. Almost there. And just to remind you what we're talking about here, 435 House seats are up, 35 Senate seats, and 36 governor's races. But we're also going to talk a little bit about races for Secretary of State. Those are very important. When was the last time we paid any attention to state attorney general races? I'm not going to have time to talk about those today, but I assure you I've been watching them assiduously. And state Secretary of State races, so important. And also I'll talk a little bit about contests for state legislatures. Extremely important, but secretaries of state preside over elections, and a number of the most significant candidates for Secretary of State this time around were election deniers. sort of bald face in their insistence. Wait a minute, I got to get rid of this again. Something floats up at the top. In their insistence that the 2020 election was stolen. Do you want someone who believes the 2020 election was stolen on the basis of absolutely no information to preside over the 2024 elections in a swing state like Pennsylvania or Nevada or Arizona or Wisconsin and so on? And it was a close thing. It looked like that very well might happen. I'm going to tell you just right now, so that you can have a deep sigh of relief. Whichever team you play for, you should be hoping that the Secretary of State in a given state is a person of integrity, not an ideologue. But in any case, all of the election deniers that were running for Secretary of State in swing states lost. 4 won, but they won in Republican-dominated states that never swing in so many ways. For example, Mike Gray was elected Secretary of State in Wyoming. He was unopposed. Secretary of State in Alabama, but they won't matter. But Arizona and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, it's a different matter, and they all lost. But we'll talk about it. That was just to give you a sense of why more than just Senate races and House races and gubernatorial races should be on our radar. Okay. So clearly it was supposed to be a red wave. I'm sorry, every time someone comes in, I have to get rid of something that pops up on the top of the screen because it will appear to you as a black space. Anyway, it was supposed to be a red wave, a red tsunami. I saw a clip the other day of outtakes from, not outtakes, but pieces from Fox News, and it was one after another, different ways to say, oh, it's going to be a red wave, we're going to be swamped, it's going to be amazing, it's going to be deliverance, and so on. Well, I've heard so many takes now about what you call what it was, since it clearly wasn't a red wave. Was it a red trickle? Was it a this or that? I finally decided on pink tide. I think that's the best we can say. It wasn't a red wave, but it certainly also wasn't a blue wave. But after all the talk about the red wave, those who play for the blue team can be forgiven for feeling like, yeah, it was kind of a blue wave in a way. So we'll talk about why anybody might want to say that. Of course, last night about 9 o'clock, I think it was, when I realized, got the message on my screen, yes, I was staring at a screen, that Nevada had been called for the Democrats, that Catherine Cortez Masto, who is the sitting senator, the incumbent, first-term senator from Nevada, and the first Latina senator in the United States Senate, had prevailed over an interesting interesting opponent, absolutely an election denier. I'm fussing around with the screen again because someone just came in the room, named Adam Paul Laxalt. Cortez Masto beat Laxalt, but Laxalt has a legacy name in Nevada, also interestingly enough in New Mexico, because he's the grandson of Paul Laxalt, that I'm sure is a name that sounds familiar to you because he was for many years the governor of Nevada. Later, he was senator from Nevada. But Adam Paul Laxalt is also the son, the illegitimate son of Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico. That's all out in the open now, and nobody is faulting him for it or anything else. He has, to his credit, Adam Paul has said he's very proud of his father, Pete Domenici, who was a Democratic senator from New Mexico, and well, except for that, had a terrific record. Anyway, so Laxalt has a lot of creds in New Mexico and in Nevada and that part of the world, but he was pretty strong coming into the race, and in the primary, he was a very strong election denier. He has since soft-pedaled it in Nevada and hasn't, and that's true of a lot of people who made it very clear that they thought the 2020 election was stolen, but then realized this is not playing well with except with the base, and you've already got the base, but it's not playing well with all those voters who have read at least part of a book. So they tended to soft pedal, and Laxalt did that anyway. Catherine Cortez Masto won, and that meant as I'm sure you know. Once again, I'm fussing with the screen. That meant that Democrats now have a majority in the Senate, because the day before, and you see here in the graphic, Mark Kelly, who was facing a guy, a tech wunderkind, if you will, named Blake Masters, who was, I think, with the exception of Mastriano in Pennsylvania, who was the candidate for governor, who was beaten by Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania Attorney General. But Mastriano was the farthest right, most extreme, most clearly neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic and so on of all the candidates, I think, of all the major GOP candidates running. Number two was clearly Blake Masters, who was running against Mark Kelly here in Arizona. Blake Masters was one of those candidates that was sponsored by the sort of quirky libertarian tech billionaire Peter Thiel, who had a lot of candidates in the various races who didn't do all that well. But anyway, he sponsored Blake Masters and paid his freight. And at certain points, it looked like Masters might overtake Mark Kelly. But in the end, Kelly won fairly handily. So that we heard yesterday. The Democrats had taken Arizona in the Senate. And last night, we heard that Catherine Cortez Masto. That means that Democrats now have 50 seats. Republicans have 49. And the 100th seat is, of course, the seat in Georgia, where Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker are fighting it out, and they will face each other in a runoff election in Georgia. Remember, last time the Senate was resolved by a Georgia runoff, two of them actually, so we're gonna see that happen again on December 6th. Couple of things to consider. One is that, and I hope this is not too much data and stuff, but Raphael Warnock closed out with about 48,000 vote lead over Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker, who is arguably the most entertaining or the most demoralizing of all of the GOP candidates. To say that he is not really qualified to be in the United States Senate is an understatement of the first water. Anyway, so that's the big news. Democrats keep the Senate. They weren't supposed to. So the other day, I'm doing a workshop last Tuesday. Here's somebody else coming in. Oops, sorry. Oh, sorry about that. I'm sorry, I accidentally stopped sharing. I hit the wrong button. So I'll do it again. Bear with me. Zoom, of course, makes this so easy. Almost.
As you're sharing again, I just repeat that we'll be taking questions at the end. And of course, we believe in civil discourse, and we'll do our best to continue with that and show our example of how we civilly discourse.
And I will do my best to be civil. Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry, if I don't seem too flustered by this, it's because I've done this to myself so many times. Shut down my screen sharing. It's very easy to do. Okay, here we are. So I was in the process of saying the other day, I'm in a class, I'm talking about the midterms. It's Tuesday morning, it's election day, and I'm doing a class on the midterms. And so I brought up the whole question of polling. And I borrowed, for this presentation, I borrowed a slide that I used that day. And here it is. Suppose the polls are wrong. It's happened before. It happened in 2016 and 2020. There's all that talk about how wrong the polls were. Actually, in 2016, the polls were not that wrong. For example, 538.com, which is a great aggregator of polls. They don't do polling, but it's one of my favorite websites. They don't do polling, but they collect all the polls that are conducted by various polling outfits. They rate them on the basis of inherent bias, also on the basis of the track record of a given poll, and then they discount or adjust their results appropriately. And then they give a sort of summary of the state of the polls in this race, that race, and that race, and so on. And in the presidential contest, on the day of the election, 538 said that Donald Trump had a 25 out of 100 chance of winning the election. And people took that to mean, since Hillary Clinton had a 75% chance, I can't tell you how many, I reported that to people. And then later people said, but you promised she'd win. No, I said she had a 75 out of 100 chance. That's 3 out of 4. That's not bad, but it's not a guarantee. And all sorts of things that have only a 1 in 4 chance of happening do happen. As a matter of fact, that same year, 538, the same website that also does a lot of sports analysis, gave the Cubs a 25% chance, a 25 out of 100 chance of winning the World Series, and they did. And they gave Donald Trump a 25% chance of winning, and he did. So in any case, it's when we hear how wrong the polls were, it's often a function of how we don't understand how polls should be read. But in 2020, polling error was very significant. Polls were in fact off. And in 2016 and 2020, both polls tended to underestimate Republicans. Now, think about it this way. If there's a polling error, it is the underestimation of the chances of one team or the other, Democrats or Republicans. In those years, it was Republicans that got underestimated. And here's a little graphic that expresses that. Republicans were underestimated, Democrats were overestimated. Whoops, Hillary didn't win. Everybody knew Hillary was guaranteed to win. That might very well, I said this, remember, last Tuesday, I said that might be happening this year. But here's the thing. All sorts of research has demonstrated, I would say conclusively, that you cannot predict which direction a polling error is going to go. If you knew that there would be a 5 or 6% polling error in a given year, you couldn't tell which direction it would go. Would it appear to favor Republicans? Would it appear to favor Democrats? Do you understand that a poll that appears to favor Republicans is good news for Democrats? And if it appears to favor Democrats, you get all that, right? So let's just suppose that this year, there's a remember, I'm talking on Tuesday, there's a normal polling error. Let's say the GOP did 5.4% better in every Senate race and 6.3% better in every House race. The reason we're picking 5.4 and 6.3 is because that's pretty much in the margin, in the region of polling errors every year. The average polling error in an election year is about 4.5 points. So 5 points, 6 points, it's well within the reach of polling errors that take place every year, every election year. They don't tend to happen in non-election years. So if that were the case and Republicans were underestimated to that extent, they would end up winning 54 Senate seats. They would have won 54 this year. They would have won Pennsylvania, Arizona, and New Hampshire, which they did not, by the way. Republicans didn't win Pennsylvania, Arizona, and New Hampshire. All of those fell to Democrats. And Republicans would pick up 46 House seats for a total of 259. Well, that's certainly not happening. So that wasn't the polling error this year. But what is a normal polling error? Just glance at this. I'm not going to take you through it, but we can look at the error in the primary, in the general election. Look down here where my cursor is. The average polling error in election years in the general election is like 4, I said 4.5, 4.3. But look down here, the combined polling error, it's always 5, 6 points, something like that. Sometimes it can be even higher. And in all years, the average about 6 points. That just gives you a sense of the range of polling error. And I blew it up. And And then I shrink it down, and then we move on. So these pesky polls, and so now I'm suggesting that we flip that hypothetical error. Let's say it's the Democrats that are underestimated, and they end up doing 5.4 points better in every Senate race and 6.3 better in every House race, the same odds they gave the Republicans. In that case, it would be Democrats winning 54 Senate seats, and they'd win all the races where they were currently favored. They'd pick up Georgia. It's still a toss-up. We don't know yet. Nevada, they did. North Carolina, they didn't. Ohio, they didn't. And Wisconsin, they did not. And they would collect 227 House seats to the GOP's 208. Well, that didn't happen either. So what do we know? There wasn't a polling error of that magnitude, either underestimating Republicans or underestimating Democrats. What it also means is that there wasn't a red wave and there wasn't a blue wave. We're somewhere in between. Not a blue wave, not a red. So the U.S. House, here's where we are now. The House hangs in the balance, slight advantage to the GOP. We're going to talk about that quite a bit more. With victories at Arizona and Nevada, Democrats hold the Senate. You know about the runoff that's coming in December. And Democrats hold or take control of many state legislatures. You may not have caught on to this yet, but it's true. Democrats have consolidated the trifecta, which means you hold all three branches of state government. You hold the governor's mansion, you hold the House, and you hold the Senate. That's called a trifecta for obvious reasons. And Democrats now, they consolidated four more. They took Minnesota's, I'll show you this a little later, but they took Minnesota's House and Senate for the first time since 1984. They took Minnesota's Senate. Did I say Minnesota? I meant Michigan. Michigan House and Senate, Minnesota's. They appear to be on the verge of taking the Pennsylvania House. Republicans were working to get super majorities that couldn't be overturned by gubernatorial veto in Wisconsin and North Carolina. It didn't happen. So those state legislatures where Democrats had control, they didn't lose a single one. Now, they should have. All the prognostications assumed that Democrats would get hammered in state legislative elections. Normally, the party in power has lost in the last several decades, has lost between 8 percentage points and 26 percentage points with regard to these state houses, state legislative elections. So that didn't happen also. And most of the election denying candidates for Secretary of State lost their races. So not a bad night, hence the gradient of color in the background, if you didn't notice that. And let's listen to
midterm elections are mostly behind us.
Larry Sabato, who is he's at the University of Virginia. He runs the Center for Politics there at the University of Virginia. He also has a center and a website called Sabato's Crystal Ball. He's one of the great prognosticators, not a poller, but a student of the polls and an averager of polls and a commentator on the polls. And you'll very often see in sites that want to make projections, they will cite 538. Sometimes they will cite another aggregator called 270 to win, more of a Republican site, but with high integrity, and otherwise Larry Sabato. So here he is. He's going to talk about the polls. This is worth a listen.
Americans may be wondering about the polls and their accuracy. In the final days and weeks leading up to Election Day, several polls had Republican Dr. Oz leading in the Pennsylvania Senate race, only to lose to Democrat John Fetterman. And in New Hampshire Senate race, where incumbent Democrat Maggie Hassan defeated her Republican opponent, Don Baldock, who seemed to be having a surge late in the race. And in Arizona, even as votes are still being counted, Democrat Katie Hobbs maintains a narrow lead ahead of Republican Carrie Lake. But that also differs from previous estimates. To break all of it down, we're joined by Larry Sabato. He's the director of the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. Larry, thanks for being with us. If you had a report card for the polling and you're going to grade it for this cycle, what would you give it?
I would give the public polls a B overall. Now, there were some states where they didn't do a particularly good job. Actually, that was true both for Democratic victories and Republican victories. I would give somewhere between a D and an F to the Republican pollsters who were clearly pursuing an agenda and who had Republican candidates up almost everywhere, either close to, tied, or above. And that was in cases where the Democratic candidate won.
So let's take that a step further and talk a little bit more about these Ds and Fs that you're giving the Republican pollsters. I mean, what was it, just an agenda? They were looking for a result, or was it just bad sampling and bad modeling?
Well, of course, I don't know. You'd have to get inside their heads. But if you forced me to guess, I would say it was the former. That is, this was part of the plan. And really, it was a clever plan in some ways. There are 6, 7 different Republican polling organizations. They don't pretend to be nonpartisan. The press knows what their bias is. The people running the polling averages know what their bias is. But there are so many of them, Catherine, and there aren't that many Democratic pollsters. In fact, very few and far between. And here's where the problem is. There are very few nonpartisan polls anymore. Universities don't do them. The major news organizations still do them, but they've gone from having 80-some polls in a midterm cycle to having 20-some polls in a midterm cycle. You can see what that does to the polling averages. It pushes it toward Republican candidates.
Right, so let's just take that a step further. Why is it that sort of academic or independent institutions are getting out of the polling business, and increasingly you're seeing sort of Republican groups get into it?
For universities and also nonpartisan groups representing, say, networks and other news organizations, the price of being wrong can be very, very high. Remember, a lot of these universities are state universities. The state government may be run by a governor representing the party opposite to the polling group's guess as to who's going to win. So these things make a difference. That's just one example. Let me add, if I can, Catherine, I'm not saying it's all one-sided. In Florida, for example, where the Republicans scored historic landslides, both Governor DeSantis and Senator Rubio, their victories were dramatically underestimated even by the Republican pollsters. So there are other problems at work here, too.
Before we get to my final question, so what are the sampling problems? Why is it that the pollsters can't seem to get the sense of the voters? Is the outreach wrong?
I don't think it's so much sampling as it is refusal rates. That is, when people are reached, more and more people say, I'm not going to participate, or they don't even pick up. And it's disproportionately, it has been, at least for several cycles, among Trump supporters. Well, maybe some of the pollsters have overcompensated for that, and as a result have estimated the electorate as being more conservative Republican than it actually is.
It sounds like a big guessing game to me. It doesn't sound too scientific. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I agree with that.
Okay, so final question. How could a Trump announcement next week about getting into 2024, that's what we're hearing based on our CBS News reporting, affect this runoff in Georgia?
Well, I can only tell you this. The senior Republican leadership is apoplectic that Trump is announcing next week, precisely because it puts him back on center stage with only 3 weeks to go until the December 6th Georgia runoff. They believe that Trump would be a negative factor for them in Georgia, just as he has been a negative factor for the Republican Party in the elections that finished Tuesday.
Larry Sabato, thank you.
Well, you heard Larry mention Florida, and there's only one place where there was really a red wave, and that is Florida. Of course, I mean, if you're talking Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, other red states, of course, red candidates, Republican candidates did as expected. They did very well. They swept all before them, but their numbers didn't go up. there was no wave action. It was just sort of par for the course. But in Florida, which until fairly recently we were thinking of as a swing state, well, Florida is swing state no longer. It is now a solidly red state, and partly that's due to, I would say in large part, it's due to this guy, to Ron DeSantis. Anyway, let's just take a look at this. Florida is now deep red. And two elections that a lot of people thought might be closer. No one thought that Ron DeSantis was going to lose to Charlie Crist, or most people didn't. Charlie Crist, former Republican governor of Florida, and then Democratic senator from Florida, now running as a Democrat, won a hard-fought primary against the state's agriculture commissioner, Nikki Fried, and he was very enthusiastic, but he got wiped out by DeSantis. And Val Demings, one of the most attractive candidates that Democrats fielded this year, the former police chief of Orlando, a congresswoman, sitting congresswoman, and so on, put up a good fight against Marco Rubio, but she got killed as well. So Florida, solid red, and they picked up 4 seats or 3 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. So this is bad long-term news for Democrats, but it's good for Ron DeSantis. He has a very big night. There's the results in the governor's race. We don't have to go through all that, but you see 59-40. That's not the final count, but pretty much. And then Marco Rubio beats Val Demings by about 58-41. And here, if you'll notice, in the Jacksonville area, north of Orlando, and near St. Petersburg, 3 congressional districts. I think that's the 7th, the 13th, and the 3rd or 4th. But who cares? Anyway, those are flipped. When you see that stripy stuff, that means it was a pickup for the party whose stripes are there. So 3 Republican pickups in the U.S. House in Florida. Now, partly that is due, or in very significant measure, that's due to the fact that DeSantis forced through a draconian redistricting measure that has made it virtually impossible for Republicans to lose the districts they hold in the U.S. House. But everybody's talking about Florida. And my wife mentioned to me the other day, said, well, how come nobody's talking about Michigan? So I'm talking about Michigan. I think what happened in Michigan is just as astounding. Michigan is as blue as Florida is now red, and that's a dramatic turn. Keep in mind that Michigan was one of 3 states that gave the presidency to Donald Trump: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. A total of 70,000 votes. Trump gave Trump the presidency over Hillary Clinton. A different total of electoral votes, but it was 40,000 votes that gave Trump Pennsylvania. It was 20,000 votes that gave him Michigan, and 20,000 more that gave him Wisconsin. And all 3 of those went for Biden. And now Michigan has really consolidated. There was a far right-wing candidate named Tudor Dixon. You see her there against Gretchen Whitmer. You remember Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, who was targeted in the kidnapping plot. She was going to be taken out in the woods, tried, and hanged by this group of white supremacists. And people who were upset about vaccination, of course, and anyway, it's hard to even find words to talk about that particular group. But in any case, there were some polls that suggested that Gretchen Whitmer was in trouble, but she prevailed 54-43 over Tudor Dixon, who was supposed to be a great Republican hope. But in the process, the House allotment remained the same. The Republicans picked up a district, the 10th. Democrats picked up the 3rd. So it's fine. It's a wash, if you will. The allotment of House seats in Michigan remains the same. And for the first time since 1984, Michigan has a state government trifecta: governor, state house, and state senate. That came about because they picked up the House and the Senate this time around in what was supposed to be a red wave year. And by the way, there was an incredible candidate, election-denying candidate named Christina Caramo, who among other things, held in her stump speeches that abortion was actually a satanic ritual a satanic ritual, and that the spread of abortion or the spread of free choice, the spread of the right to choose is actually a satanic plot that's spreading fast across the country. She didn't win. She lost to Jocelyn Benson, the sitting Secretary of State. So good news from Michigan if you play for the blue team. And Joe Biden here is beating the odds. Interestingly enough, Biden is the most successful. That's supposed to go away. It's not going away. So I have to tell you what's behind that slide, if it were behaving properly. Biden is the most successful midterm president, sitting president, going into the midterm since 1998, when Bill Clinton was the president. In that year, the Democrats picked up 5 seats in the House. The Senate, which was in Republican control with a 55 to 45 seat majority, remained the same. So Democrats didn't lose any more seats. They didn't gain any seats. The Senate stayed the same, but the Democrats actually picked up 5 seats. So since 1998, because you know the drill, you've heard this again and again and again, it is gospel. It is conventional wisdom. Everybody knows that the sitting president's party in the midterms gets, as Barack Obama famously said, shellacked. Well, it didn't happen this time, but it almost always does. Only a couple of times in 20th century history that it didn't happen. And one of those was 1998, and that's the last time it happened. So Biden squeaked by here. I promised to say something about state legislatures. There's Gretchen Whitmer with her lieutenant governor celebrating her victory there in Michigan. And these state legislatures, I can't tell you how significant this is for Democrats. Democrats have ignored the races for state legislatures. And so Republicans dominate that tally. But this time, as I said to you before, the party in power typically loses 8 to 26% of seats that they hold in the state legislatures. But in 2022, Democrats apparently did not lose control of any state legislature that they currently hold. That's enormously significant. And they flipped the Michigan State House and the Michigan State Senate. I just told you that for a trifecta there. And they also flipped the Minnesota State Senate, trifecta there. And it looks like they're going to flip the Pennsylvania House, trifecta there. So that's kind of amazing. And they also blocked GOP efforts to gain supermajorities. A supermajority just means you got enough votes that the governor can't effectively veto your legislation. And they were hoping for a supermajority in North Carolina and in Wisconsin. They didn't get either one of them. So that's significant. What about independent voters? Well, interestingly enough, they broke strongly for Democrats. And that was almost certain. It was almost a foregone conclusion that would not happen. So we have 4 measures here nationally, and I'll show you this, but independent voters broke, I think, 4% for Democrats. In Pennsylvania, you see the yellow stripe, they went 18% for Democrats. In Georgia, about 28%, and in Arizona, about 30%. Let's see if I got those numbers right. I don't know. Nationally, 4%. Yeah, Pennsylvania by 18%. In Georgia, so far so good. Yep, got them right. In Georgia by 28% and in Arizona by 30%. How astonishing that is that independent voters broke so strongly for Democrats. Here's an interesting thing. A significant majority, it varies by state, but in general, the preponderance of independent voters, if you ask them the second question after, are you an independent? To which party do you lean? If you had to vote for one of the parties, which one would it be for? The preponderance of independent voters, this should not surprise you, say Republican. So they are independent, but they have pulled back from the Republican Party. So for independent voters to break for Democrats in these numbers is, I think, extremely significant. And this perhaps is my favorite of all. We had a number of candidates who expressed a sympathy for the QAnon doctrine, which of course is that the Democratic Party gets its funding and is deeply involved. Every Democrat is deeply involved in a global satanic conspiracy that is grounded in pedophilia and cannibalism. All Democrats practice pedophilia and cannibalism, and that, of course, is where they get their money. And who's in charge of the whole scheme? Of course, it's Hillary. Who else would it be in charge of the whole thing? That's a big part of what QAnon believes. So if you see somebody holding a Q sign, you know that it's someone who got a 3 on his ACTs and is just looking for something to do. Anyway, here are 3 big candidates. I just want to suggest something about how dramatic the shift has been. So let's start at the bottom. Ohio 9th. Marcy Kaptur, a veteran of the House, long time veteran Democratic Congresswoman, prevailed against this guy, J.R. Majewski, who, among other things, faked his army and his military record. So I saw a cartoon the other day. He's holding up a sign saying, "I proudly served in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Civil War, and the Revolutionary War." Anyway, he was also a big QAnon guy. Well, he lost, but how big a swing was it? This state district is an R+3 district. That's a rating of how the state, that particular district, has voted over the years. It's voted by about 3 points Republican. This time around, it voted 13 points Democrat, which is a 16-point swing. You got to think about the swing. Marjorie Taylor Greene won. She beat Marcus Flowers, but her district is a Republican 37. She scored 32, so that's a 5-point swing. And in Colorado, in my home state, I can't tell you how we are all watching this. My whole family is texting about this race. It won't be decided until Thursday, but Lauren Boebert, who is the dingiest member, with the possible exception of Marjorie Taylor Greene, now that Madison Cawthorn is gone and Louis Gohmert has retired, she is the nuttiest member of Congress, and she was guaranteed. This race was rated Adam Frisch was given about a 3 out of 100 chance to beat her, and he's holding his own. She is about 1,100 votes ahead, and a lot of votes left to be counted that are likely to favor him, but we won't know the answer till Thursday. But already there's an 8-point Democratic swing. Even if she wins, already an 8-point Democratic swing. Just so you see them, there's Lauren and Adam Frisch. And there's Marjorie Taylor Greene and Marcus Flowers. You're going to hear more from this guy. He was a very strong candidate. And here's J.R. Majewski. You won't hear any more about him. And Marcy Kaptur, who is returning to the House. So here we're talking about denial. A majority, think about this, a majority of GOP candidates running for House, Senate, governor, state legislator, attorney general, or secretary of state. That's the ones we're including here. That's 299 in all. Are election deniers. 299 of Republican candidates are election deniers. The 2020 election was rigged or stolen. Now, here's a survey or a summary from WAPO, from the Washington Post. Majority of Republican nominees for House, Senate, and key statewide offices denied or questioned. There are some that are cautious about it. They say, well, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned, or, there's plenty of evidence and so on. There's no evidence whatsoever. Anyway, deniers or questioners. Of the nearly 300 on the ballot, though, get this, 173 ran in safe Republican seats. And this is a slide from before, so the tense is wrong. 52 will compete in tightly contested races. 52 did run in tightly contested races. We don't have all the data yet, all the info, but 60% of Americans had an election denier on the ballot. How about that? If you vote in Illinois, you had an election denier on the ballot. Darren Bailey. Absolutely strong, forthright election denier. Donald Trump was legitimate winner, and if I'm governor of Illinois, we're going to make sure that Donald Trump wins next time. Of course, that's one of the powers of the governor of Illinois. So denialist candidates, here are some of my favorites. These are three really bad apples. That's Christina Caramo. Abortion is a satanic plot. That's Mark Fincham, who ran for Secretary of State in Arizona and lost. They all three lost. And Jim Marchant, we only got the news about him this morning that he lost. He was the strongest of them all, a candidate in Nevada. And he put together an organization of it was something like Secretaries of State for Freedom, of all the election denying secretaries of state around the country. Fortunately, with the exception of red states where it really doesn't ultimately matter, those who are in swing states all lost, including these three, who are arguably the three very, very worst. And here's Kari Lake, running for governor of Arizona, big election denier. She's already setting up to deny her own election unless she wins. Of course, she has said, people have said, are you going to accept the results of your election? She said, I'm going to win, and that result I will accept. But if you don't win, well, I'm going to win, and that result I will accept. She's now trailing Katie Hobbs. Interestingly enough, Katie was the is the current Secretary of State in Arizona, and so here's Kari Lake saying, not only is this Arizona election compromised, and there's a lot of shenanigans going on, but it's Katie Hobbs, my opponent for governor, who's behind the whole scheme. So she will not go graciously into the good night if she loses, fingers crossed. So there's Kari Lake, for governor of Arizona. Mark Fincham, Secretary of State candidate from Arizona, lost. Jim Marchant, Secretary of State candidate from Nevada, lost this morning. Doug Mastriano, governor, lost first day in Pennsylvania, lost to Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, who creamed him. And Christina Caramo, Secretary of State candidate for Michigan. This is, it's just one of my favorite graphics. It's all blurry, but I've spent a lot of time with it trying to see if I can pick people out. The ones who are depicted in shadow, this came from the Washington Post. The ones who are depicted in shadow are the ones who have no chance. The ones who you sort of see are the ones that had some chance. And I will tell you that most of those depicted here got elected, were elected. About 173 of the 299 were running in safe Republican districts or states or whatever. So unfortunately. Here's Illinois. Mike Bost, election denier, elected. Mary Miller, election denier, elected. Darren LaHood, you may remember his father, Ray LaHood, who was a longtime Republican congressman and so on, but a very bipartisan inclined guy. And I think he was actually a really good congressman. His son is way around the bend. He was elected. Reagan Deering, nope. Catalina Lauf also defeated, and Darren Bailey, just the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, there's a lot to be amused by there. Anyway, he was, of course, defeated, but a big election denier. Now, so one of the big questions is election denial on its last legs? And my guess is that the answer is yes. I do think this has been a very hard election for election deniers. Here's my home state of Colorado. I put up Illinois and Colorado. Here's Lauren, who's in the race of her young life. Doug Lamborn, who always gets reelected, from Colorado's 5th district, Colorado Springs, most conservative place in the universe. Eric Adland, not favored and defeated. Jennifer Calteri defeated, and Heidi Ganahl, the candidate for governor of Colorado, soundly defeated by Jared Polis, the sitting governor. So how did election deniers in general do in their midterm races? Who won, who lost, which races are still uncalled? I thought you might be interested in this. So candidates in denial. It's interesting. I was just glancing at this slide and I had written down all Republicans, by which I meant all the denial candidates were Republicans. And then I realized that it didn't exactly read that way. No, all Republicans are not election deniers by any means. And certainly it's Republicans who hold office that tend to be election deniers. Republicans who, are out and about in the world, Republicans that you are or and so on, are really not election deniers. This is a stunt. It's a pose. It's a costume that is worn by office holders and candidates and so on. Among Republicans in general, election denial, and the numbers are very clear, election denials is not rife. There's a suspicion that maybe there's something wrong. Yeah, people will admit to that. But Joe Biden is not the legitimate president. Responses on that from Republicans very, very low, unless they are office holders. So I changed it to Republicans all. Secretary of State, 12 ran, 4 won, 8 lost. And there they are. Now, it's interesting, these 4 that won up here, you see the green, they won, and they're all in very safe Republican states. As I said, Chuck Gray over here in Wyoming didn't even have any opposition. Here's Jim Marchant. When this was put together, this graphic, it's gray, you see. His race had not been decided, but this morning it's decided he's out. Rayla Campbell, blah, blah, blah. Mark Fincham, one of the very worst. Christina Caramo, Dominic Rapini. These are extreme candidates, all out, all lost. Brooke Page in Vermont looks like he'd be fun at a barbecue, but his idea of the electoral process would give you chills. Governor, 22 ran. Can you imagine? 22 election deniers ran for governor. 8 won. 12 lost. 2 are too early to call. Kari Lake in Arizona and Mike Dunleavy in Alaska. He's way ahead. He will win. Alaska is complicated by ranked choice voting and so on, but he will win. Here's Mike Dunleavy. Here's Kari Lake. Darren Bailey. You see, here are the ones that won. Kay Ivey, by the way, from Alabama, she would just amaze you. She'd knock your socks off when she talks about the election and how it was stolen. And they brought in truckloads of ballots. She's got all of these old fantasies that were trotted out. And she believes the stuff about the 13-year dead dictator of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, somehow having a hand in stealing the 2020 election, reaching from beyond the grave. She believes all that. She is a trip, I guarantee. But anyway, all these folks that won are, to a certain degree, election deniers. Kristi Noem and Kim Reynolds, extreme election deniers, as is Sarah Huckabee Sanders. There's a blast from the past. She is now the governor, a governor-elect of Arkansas. And all the rest lost, including Doug Mastriano. And finally, in the Senate, 18 ran, 10 won, 8 lost, 1 runoff, Herschel Walker. These are senators in denial. Laxalt lost. We go to the lost here, and Herschel Walker still a runoff. And so on. I have stories to tell about all these people, but I will spare you. So what about this lot? Here's the interesting thing. Already there are people, Democrats, who are thinking of replacing Nancy Pelosi. A lot of Republicans did not want Kevin McCarthy to be speaker, but he still has to stand for leader of the opposition, for minority leader. And I think he's going to have a tough race. There were Republicans in the Senate that were trying to delay the leadership elections because they wanted to replace Mitch McConnell. They're blaming Mitch McConnell for this lackluster finish. And if this is back when they still thought Republicans were going to take the Senate, now that Republicans haven't taken the Senate, there will still be an election for minority leader. And will McConnell come through? I can't imagine that he won't. I think McCarthy McCarthy's job might be in trouble. And I think Nancy Pelosi must at this point be thinking of stepping aside. We'll see. I'll be very interested to see that. Chuck Schumer, it is what it is. I think he'll stick around. There's the Senate. The stripy states have have one of each, a Republican and a Democrat. Up here in Maine and Vermont, you see the green stripe. That's because they have one Republican and one independent. Up here, Angus King, and here Bernie Sanders is the green stripe in Vermont. And here are the contests that were held. Now, this is the way the map appeared on November 7th, with Georgia and Nevada as toss-ups, Arizona as leaning blue, and it went blue, Pennsylvania as leaning red. That's the lightest gradation of leaning red. But here's what actually happened. There's just the code to the colors. You don't need that. And here's what happened with 49 Republicans and 50 Democrats. That's the Senate. And just a glance at some key Senate races that actually told the tale. I think you know all this stuff, but it doesn't hurt. Pennsylvania was an open seat. Toomey retired, and so that was a Republican who held the seat. So open seat, it means if Democrats get it, they pick up a seat. This is Democrats' only pickup. John Fetterman, and Democrats don't stand to pick up another state. So this is again Fetterman beating Mehmet Oz, although the numbers appeared to suggest that Oz had a real chance at pulling it out, but in the end he didn't, and Fetterman won dramatically. Georgia, of course, Herschel Walker, the unbelievable candidate, and Raphael Warnock. There will be a runoff in December. My feeling is that Democrats are really going to rally to this race. It'll be interesting to see, though, because just on the face of it, you would say that the situation, the odds, the dynamics of a re-election or a runoff race in Georgia would favor the Republican. So we'll see what happens, whether it's Herschel Walker or not. Nevada, late call last night. Catherine Cortez Masto wins. And Arizona, earlier yesterday, Mark Kelly beats Blake Masters. Now, there were also these other seats, just in case, these other Senate seats, in case you were wondering about these, that for a time Democrats thought, yeah, maybe this is possible, blue dream possibility. They seem possible for Democrats, but no. North Carolina, a terrific candidate, Sherry Beasley, Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, just amazing. You're going to hear from her more. Keep in mind that she would make an excellent nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court and is already being talked about that way. Wisconsin, everybody thought that maybe, or a lot of people thought maybe it was time at last to turn out Ron Johnson, one of the less perspicacious members of the U.S. Senate. But no, he prevailed against Mandela Barnes, another candidate you're going to hear a lot from. He's going to be around. Tim Ryan was supposed to be absolutely obliterated by J.D. Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy. But no, he really held his own, and it was a closer race than anyone thought it had any right to be. Iowa, interesting. I put the 2 question marks there because it never really was up for grabs, but for a time it looked like it, that Chuck Grassley had met his match, and this was closer than Grassley has seen in a long time. And finally, in Florida, everybody thought on the Democratic side that Val Demings was such a terrific candidate that she might have a chance of beating Marco Rubio, but no. He beat her badly, but Val Demings is not going to go away. These losing candidates, Beasley and Barnes and Ryan and Franken and Demings, are going to be around. They're part of the new young leadership of the Democratic Party. We'll go on a little bit longer. The House of Representatives, here's the map the way you usually see it. And the thing about this is that the great majority of the Democrats concentrate in urban areas with high population. that works to their disadvantage in a presidential election year because of the distribution of electoral votes. So look at all that red swath there. A lot of electoral votes are represented there, but not a lot of people live there. And so when you look at this map, you would get the impression that everybody in the country is a Republican, and that is not at all the case. As a matter of fact, when you compare the numbers of self-identified Democrats, there are more of them than there are of Republicans, and self-identified independents fall right in the range of self-identified Democrats. So this is very misleading. This is a little bit better. I like this proportional map. Gives you, and every square represents a congressional seat. It's much more informative, I think. And the ones that have the hash lines are ones where the contest had not been resolved as of yesterday when I grabbed up this map. Let's listen to this.
Kornacki, let's go right back to him. He's got breaking news as it concerns the House of Representatives.
Steve Kornacki fix.
Yeah, I mean, we've been tracking that battle for control of the House, which is still unsettled, and our NBC News decision desk has been updating its estimate of where it's going to land. We still have more than 20 uncalled races, and the decision desk has just revised its estimate for where the House will land. And look at this, 218 seats needed for a majority in the House, and we are now estimating that Republicans will finish with 219.
This is from last
that is
night.
down from our previous estimate, which had them at 220. And I would stress the margin for error here is plus or minus 4 seats. So the Republican range could still extend into the low 220s, but it could also fall under 218, meaning that Democrats still very much have a possibility of retaining control of the House. Again, our estimate is now 219 to 216, and that is plus or minus 4 seats. So the House very much in play according to our model. And what that means just in terms of where the action is, here's the big picture. Red are the seats Republicans have won. Blue, the seats that Democrats have won. Gray are the uncalled seats. There are 21, I could put the full number here. There are 211 seats so far that Republicans have won. There are 203 that Democrats have won. That leaves 21 uncalled Democrat versus Republican races that are going to decide control of the House. Democrats are going to need to win 15 of those 21 districts. That will give them control. Republicans will need to win 7 of those 15. That will get them control.
Now, what's interesting about this is that in these, here's just a picture of the House races that are still outstanding. And I'm not going to take you through all of them, but I will show you. You can glance at them. What's interesting is that about 7 of these are Democratic leaning, Democratic incumbent, and leaning to the Democrats. So it's closer than anyone might have guessed. Remember, the decision desk for MSNBC is saying, for NBC actually, is saying when all is said and done, Republicans are going to have 219. And that's just 1 over a majority. And Democrats will have however many they ended up with. But the point is that can go either way. There's an error factor of plus or minus 4. And that's, as I say, from last night. There have been very little updating. There's been very little updating. One of these 21 races has been called. And that was a race in Washington that, as it happens, I've been following throughout since about May, because there was a really interesting young woman candidate named Marie Gluesenkamp Perez. So, of course, she got the whole German vote and the Hispanic vote. And she was an auto shop owner. She is an auto shop owner, and she had a miscarriage and couldn't get an appointment to see a physician except at the local Planned Parenthood Center. And as she went into the Planned Parenthood Center for her appointment to deal with the miscarriage she had just had, she was virtually attacked and harassed and screamed at and yelled at and called names by these thuggish people who were everywhere around. And so that decided her. She decided that she was going to get involved in politics, and she did. Well, nobody gave her a chance. And late yesterday, she won. And she beat a MAGA crazy guy named Joe Kent, who is a matinee idol, gorgeous former Green Beret, worked for the CIA and so on. But he's a vaccine denier, election denier, Trump supporting anyway. So you never know. So as you just glance at these races, here's one thing that's interesting. So many of them, there's 2 in Arizona. Look how many are in California. So far, 6, I think 6 total, 7, 8, 9, I'm sorry, in California, unresolved, 10. Colorado number 3, that's the race I told you about, Lauren Boebert against Adam Frisch. Colorado number 8, they still have it here as unresolved. No, Kirkmeyer, the Republican, conceded to Caraveo, the Democrat, so that's in the Democratic column. And here we go with Maine, New Mexico, and New York. So if you just look at the red and blue stripes here as we went through that, then you see that this could go either way, absolutely. And so, oh, there's one more. 2 races in Oregon, and here's that race in Washington, Glusenkamp Perez versus Joe Kent, and it's done. It's already in the Democratic column, and I'm going to just wind up with a little snapshot of this race. There, I told you he was a matinee idol. Doesn't have enough brains to rub together, but he looks good. And here is Marie Glusenkamp Perez in her auto shop. This is a district that's on the southwestern border, Republican leaning. It was a Trump +4 in 2020, but it's also fairly moderate, highly educated population and so on. So it makes it an almost perfect 2022 congressional microcosm. Joe Kent, former Green Beret, CIA, long military record and tragic personal story. Yeah, his wife was a cryptologist who was working in Afghanistan and working with one of the intelligence agencies, and she was killed in an IED explosion, a roadside explosion. So it is a terrible story. But he has emerged as a white supremacist, election denying MAGA, as I said here, superhero. Who will be probably heard from again. He's the most prominent election denier in the Pacific Northwest. I don't know what that amounts to, but anyway, he is. And here she is, deeply concerned about abortion rights. You can imagine a shoestring campaigner. Campaign manager lives in a trailer in her driveway. And on the day of the election, 538 gave her a 2 out of 100 chance of winning. And by golly, there's the 538 odds. And Washington State's 3rd district, and she beat him 50.5 to 48.9. So where does that leave us? That was called yesterday for her, leaves us right here with a very disgruntled Donald Trump. You know, this weekend was the wedding of Tiffany Trump, and it's the first time ever that I felt sorry for one of the Trump children. But, you know, her wedding, and everybody said he was just skulking around Mar-a-Lago, stomping around, so annoyed. Day before yesterday, he announced that Melania was to blame for his endorsement of Mehmet Oz. Well, of course she was. I mean, she watches Oprah, he doesn't, so I'm sure that's true. Anyway, this is an outraged Trump, but here is perhaps the victor of the day. This is turning out to be the Ron DeSantis story, so we'll see. Someone said Ron DeSantis is Trump, perhaps slightly less demonstrably crazy, but much, much more boring on the stump. His speaking style is soporific. but boy, does he attract supporters. So it'll be interesting. And with that, we're done. You can raise a hand if you want. How do you do that? Go under
Right.
reaction.
Raise a hand. You can put it in the chat. I'll see it there. You've given us so much to think about. And here, let's go. Gail, I'm going to unmute you. Go right ahead.
You hear so much on the on television and so forth of people speculating that this is that the Trump fever has been broken and that people have voted for sanity. And I just wonder to what extent you think that is the case.
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting reaction, and I understand that reaction, and I hope it's true. It might be a little premature, and we don't know enough yet to know. He's so unpredictable, and his base is so unpredictable. And think about being a member of the Trump base and someone who has attended rallies and so on. How much you have to sort of come to terms with yourself and say, I was deeply wrong. I was a little nuts. I was, and that's very hard to do. It's not just a matter of saying, well, he turned out not to be the guy I thought. No, you have to say to a certain degree, I turned out not to be the person I thought. So I think that's very difficult. But discredited, I'll tell you this, the Republican establishment, what's left of the Republican establishment is fit to be tied with Donald Trump, and really, really hoping the immediate issue is whether or not he's going to announce his candidacy and do that on Tuesday. And all signs point to yes. I know that's a magic 8-ball reading. All signs point to yes. But it seems very likely that he will. And if he does, that's probably bad news for the Republican runoff chances in Georgia. So I don't know, but I think you're right. There are plenty of signs that the fever may have broken to a certain. People are finding the courage to vote no. Yeah.
I'm not going to comment on whether Trump uses a magic 8-ball. We have Mark, then Amy, and then there's a question in the chat. But Mark, go ahead.
Hello. If the Republicans edge out the House, what type of chaos are we going to see currently and going forward, starting in January, for them selecting a Speaker of the House and that person remaining a Speaker of the House?
That's really a good question. I'm really glad you asked it. Mark, is it?
Yes.
A couple of things. If Republicans, I'm glad you phrased it the way you do, edge into, take the House, it's going to be a small majority. It's not going to be the 30 or 40 or even 50 seats that were bruited about. People were really talking about that kind of majority. Well, it's not going to be anywhere near that. And Kevin McCarthy, let's just imagine that McCarthy becomes Speaker. Vanessa, you screwed up your face when I said, let's imagine that McCarthy becomes Speaker. You know who the most likely alternative is? Jim Jordan.
Oh my God. I never thought I'd say go Kevin McCarthy.
I know. But in any case, McCarthy, let's say he's Speaker. He's going to have his hands full with the Jim Jordans, the Matt Gaetzes, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, maybe Lauren Boebert, with that crazy caucus, the Freedom Caucus, and so on. He's going to have his hands full because they are obstructionists, they're obstreperous. Their mantra, and which was perfectly expressed by this guy Joe Kent, running in Wisconsin. So, Joe, if you get to Congress, what are you going to do? He says, it's a very simple thing. I got 3 words for you. We're going to obstruct, we're going to investigate, and we're going to impeach. Obstruction, investigation, impeachment. Now, do you hear any note of policy in there? Anything at all about how they're going to address inflation? They're complaining about inflation and crime and the border, but any policy that would address immigration or crime or the economy? No, they're going to be busy. But here's McCarthy, who does have something of an agenda. High on his agenda is starting up building the wall. He wants to close off the border, and he thinks that would seal him in with his base. but he's not going to be able to get anything done with these people because they're going to have their own agenda. So a Republican caucus or a Republican majority of only a handful, it seems to me, will not easily be able to dismantle the Biden agenda. I think the administration will often be able to get the votes it needs to do some important things. But I think, Mark, you're always also getting at how much trouble is Kevin McCarthy in, and how crazy is it going to be? And I think it's going to be a zoo because Republicans are angry, and the sort of the bottom line is that people are looking for someone to blame. And in the Senate, it's Mitch McConnell, who didn't spend money wisely. He didn't allocate. Already Trump is saying that if McConnell had spent all the money that he spent in a different way, then we would have had a red wave. Trump always has to blame somebody else. As a matter of fact, I heard an interview with Trump the other day when somebody said, well, if your candidates don't do well, what does that say about your choices and your endorsements? He says, if they do well, I get the credit. If they don't, I get none of the blame. Straight face, hard to countenance what it must be like inside there. Anyway, great question, Mark.
We have Amy, then a question, and then Rob Behrman. Amy.
I'm just wondering about the future of Liz Cheney. It seems like so many people believe that the Republican Party needs to be burnt to the ground, restructured, and brought back again with like the Adam Kissingers, the Liz Cheneys. How do you see the future of the Republican Party once Trump is out?
Yeah, there are some folks, let's say the Lincoln Project crowd, who are, most of whom have disavowed the Republican Party. They have left the Republican Party, but they're at pains to reaffirm their conservative credentials. You don't leave the Republican Party and slide right over to the Democratic Party or the Libertarians either. I mean, most of those folks would not be comfortable with the Libertarian fringe. So quite a few of them are talking about a different party. Nothing could be more difficult to accomplish in America the way we are today than restarting the Republican Party. Anyway, the likeliest thing is for a sort of coming back together of the Republican Party. People like Michael Steele, a very moderate voice, who is former chair of the Republican National Committee, says, no, you don't start a new party, you fix the existing party. And we need people like Liz Cheney and so on. What's interesting about Cheney, first of all, she's going to be a big name. She has a big family name, but she made a lot of creds with her behavior, her courage, clear courage, as she was forced out of her committee assignments and nevertheless insisted on being part of the House Select Committee, as did Adam Kinzinger. Kevin McCarthy didn't want any Republican members on that committee, and they both said, no, we're going to join the committee, and that cost them. And so Kinzinger resigned, and now Cheney is out. But it's important for all the Democrats who worship Liz Cheney now to realize that she's one of the most conservative members of the House. She voted with Donald Trump about 95% of the time. And she's not going to change her stripes. She's extremely, extremely conservative. But she's also has a lot of integrity and has some humanitarian concerns. So I think would be a great person to be in the Republican Party. If the Republican Party were to be reconfigured, she would be a natural sort of figure that would emerge as the voice of the farther right in the Republican Party. And I think she wants to be in the Republican. The only thing she has said about it is this, that if Donald Trump is the nominee in 2024, she will resign. But she hasn't left the party yet.
Fascinating.
I'm just stabbing around there. I don't have any real answers for that.
Bill Rosen asked, do you expect 2020 election deniers who ran for office in 2022 and lost deny their own election losses in 2022?
In many cases, I do. That's a great question. Do they? Because a lot of them, like Jim Marchant, who lost Secretary of State race in Nevada, and Mark Fincham, who lost in Arizona, they've already set it up. They prepared the ground, saying, the only way I can lose is in a rigged election. And Marchant was campaigning, promising that not only would he be elected, but that his election would guarantee the election of Donald Trump in 2024. So these people have delusions of everything. But I think you're going to find a lot of denial on the part of. But the thing is that they're not going to be able to get any traction, because even their state parties, the state party in Arizona is not going to support Mark Fincham in a major campaign to, retool or redo or, remake the Secretary of State election. So I think they're going to just exhaust themselves and become more and more irrelevant. I do hope that this has driven a nail into election denial. It's not gone forever, but I think it's has been significantly wounded. It's unsustainable.
Rob Behrman, I just unmuted you. Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thanks a lot for the presentation. Today seems to be a day that people that are in favor of, human rights and tolerance and acceptance and free and fair elections can breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief. But having said that, if you take the position that what Donald Trump actually did was reveal the true colors of the Republican Party, what do we do now? I mean, when you think about it, the silence over the last 6 years from pretty much every Republican except Cheney and Kinzinger, the silence has been deafening.
Right.
Very few of the people in office, certainly the leaders, never push back on him, beginning with what he said after Charleston. So I don't think it's over. I don't think the Trump fever is over, because I think the Republican Party is only out there to gain power, grab power, keep it in whatever way they can. So for those of us that would like to be a grassroots fighter and keep pushing against all of this, what do we do now?
Yeah, well, I haven't got a playbook for you. I mean, there are a lot of playbooks out there, and I'm sure you're quite aware of the Indivisible movement and Move On and so on. Talk about playbooks. They really, they have enormous advice and valuable advice to give us all. I agree with you. And I was when I was talking about whether Trump fever is over, I'm talking about Donald fever, not whether the Republican Party is all better. It's not. And Republican office holders at the moment, the Republican Party, we all knew, a lot of people belong to, a lot of people in this group belong to, may still belong to that Republican Party, at least in terms of the public face of that Republican Party, is no more. No question about it. You said something about it's all about power. I could not agree more. It's absolutely all about power. Otherwise, how do you explain fealty to someone like Donald Trump? How do you explain embracing this incredible tapestry of continuous lies that contradict each other and so on? It makes no sense. It's made a mockery of the United States. But I do think that what's happening is that people who have succumbed to this virus, that it's all about power, absolute power corrupts absolutely, as Lord Acton said long ago. Interestingly, I just have to throw something in here because a lot of people aren't aware of this. He was an Anglican observer who attended the First Vatican Council in 1870. And that council declared the doctrine of papal infallibility. That when the Pope was speaking about matters of doctrine or morals, a Pope could not make a mistake. And Lord Acton's response was to say, absolute power corrupts, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was talking about the Pope. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that in. But I think that people who have decided it's all about power and we we will absolutely subvert voting rights, and we will redistrict to the point that that no sitting Republican office holder can ever be dethroned, and so on. Yeah, I think that's all there, and it's locked in for this current crop of office holders. But I think they are likely to be deciding right now that Trump has outlived his usefulness, that Trump is a liability. That's what I meant when I said it'll be interesting to see whether Trump fever has really broken. I'm inclined to say that people in the Republican Party are increasingly done with Trump. And people who think about this, think about Republicans who voted for him once, maybe voted for him twice. Are they still as sanguine about him, or are they beginning to recognize that he has pushed the envelope, too far? People in the party, it's a different question. But I think they are behind closed doors. I think they're deciding that they gotta do something about this guy because he has become a liability. That doesn't mean they will change their stripes.
And, we are talking at Macomb, so we can't get away without one Jewish Israel question. What do you think this all means for Israel?
Oh, well, that's such a generic question. It's pretty hard to know where to jump in.
Right, this person said something about JNF PAC. I don't know if they mean APAC candidates. I'm not 100%.
Well, I'll tell you this, that there are a number of candidates that APAC set out to defeat, and by and large, they failed. There's a lot of APAC money that went into defeating Democratic progressives, like members of the Squad, like AOC and Ilhan Omar and so on. That didn't work. So, and I'm not sure that I don't think it made any friends. I think it looked a little mean-spirited. Anyway, but in general,
yes.
What does this mean for Israel? I would say that that Republican support for this is an old story and an old song, and I'm reluctant to even bring it up. But I will say this. Overwhelmingly, the new Republican Party, the Republican Party as it is now, we didn't talk about this, is Christian nationalist. This is a Christian nationalist party. And Christian nationalism is underlain by a movement called dominionism, which is a small group within the evangelical movement. And dominionism is the idea that Christians should have dominion, that the Christian man should have dominion over his family, the family should have dominion over the neighborhood over the town over the city, and the city over the nation, and the nation over the world. That's dominionism, the idea that when Jesus returns, Jesus will not come back with mercy and love and a smile on his face, but wielding a bloody sword. It's the gift, confirmation gift for a young man in this Christian nationalist movement. The most common gift, although it's very pricey, is a Confederate officer's sword, which should tell you something. This is an extremely ugly movement. And the idea that to be Christian nationalists are very vocal in their support for Israel, but they're vocal in their support for Israel because they have this prophetic notion that Israel has to succeed, the temple has to be rebuilt so that the Jews can be wiped away and Christians can become the triumphant remnant. So this is not any sort of Israel friendly or Judaism friendly. It's not Christianity and Judaism together again. No, it's nothing like that. It's a prophecy that says first Israel has to ascend and the temple has to be rebuilt and then be wiped away for Jesus to return. So with friends like that.
Listen, that is the beginning of a new lecture. We'll have to have you back in the spring. We can talk about that. Now, I know that at Macomb, we're going to have envelopes to encourage Georgia voters to get out and vote. Jim, what do you leave us on? What should we be doing? How can we be good citizens?
Be good citizens by being and this is, boy, talking to the choir here, but by being as informed as you can, by informing someone else every time you have the opportunity, and I don't mean in a pedantic way, you know what I mean, in a gentle and loving way, and by participating in whatever way in the political process and in the social process and the compassionate process in every way that that you can. And you all do that. So
We
keep it
do.
up.
We do, and we thank you. And we have clergy that lead us in this way. I remind
I know you
everyone.
do.
Yeah, I remind everyone that this afternoon is Russell Stern's concert. Next week, we're in person with Dr. Stephen Moffick of how to talk to your relatives at the Thanksgiving table, should perhaps they have some other political viewpoints than you do. So, Jim, we can't thank you enough. You're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat, and we look forward to seeing everyone. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. Good Thanksgiving. See everybody in person next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thanks, Ike.
Great.